This is going to be the first video in the epidemiology series. So let's go ahead and start with a brief review of what we've talked about so far that's relevant now, and that is going to be Koch's postulates. So remember that Robert Koch was in a race with Pasteur to associate a microorganism with a disease. And we call the organism that's causing the disease the causative agent. But in more fancy science terms, we refer to it as the etiologic agent. So for Robert Koch, the etiological agent for anthrax was Bacillus anthracis. So what Koch's postulates are the set of steps that need to be taken to prove that a microorganism causes a disease. And so it starts with isolating the pathogen from a diseased host, growing up that pathogen in the lab, using that new pathogen to infect a new healthy host. That healthy host should now get sick, and then we should be able to isolate that same pathogen from the diseased host, which is proving that the host was nice and healthy before that pathogen came along, and that the pathogen is still there at the end of the disease, showing that it was responsible. Now, unfortunately, things aren't always quite that simple because we have certain organisms that we can't grow in the lab very easily or at all. We can't always just go around infecting people with things like Ebola, right? So it's not quite as black and white, but it's good guidelines to try and associate an organism with a disease. So let's take this, right? That was kind of step one, associating an organism with a disease. And so now, as we kind of turn our focus a little more towards epidemiology, we are looking at kind of the distribution and determinants in specified populations when it comes to pathogens, okay, and diseases, okay. Epidemiologists do focus on non-disease related things as well, but for the purpose of this class, we're looking at, how disease is spreading throughout a population, how it's affecting the population, why is it affecting the population the way that it is. Okay, so we're looking at a lot of like frequencies, the frequency of infection, perhaps of death, and the patterns of that distribution to try and glean some really important information that we can use to hopefully limit the spread of the disease and ideally prevent it from occurring again. So with COVID, there's been some really increased interest in epidemiology, and so I wanted to include this slide in this table that shows other just general public health problems, issues, events that are investigated. So you do not need to memorize this table. It's more just helpful information for you, especially if you know anybody that's interested in pursuing this field. So when it comes to epidemiology, there are two measures that are really, really important. And that is going to be incidence and prevalence, because both of these measures are going to offer really useful insight into the disease and how it's spreading and possibly why. So the first is going to be incidence, which is a measure of the number of new cases of the disease. So you can see in this graph here, incidence is only what's coming in. Prevalence is going to be the total number of cases. So prevalence includes those new cases, but also the old cases, okay? And so when we're thinking about, especially as healthcare professionals, what do we need to report and why? When is incidence more important, and maybe when is prevalence also or just as important? So when we want to think about this, the first thing you want to determine is the disease an acute disease or a chronic disease. Because remember, the acute diseases are the ones that make you feel like you've been hit by a train, right? It comes on kind of out of the blue, but luckily it normally lasts a very short time. So if a disease is acute, then incidence and prevalence are normally going to be about the same because people aren't living with that disease for an extended period of time. So really you only need to worry about reporting incidents, those new cases. Now, if we are going to be dealing with a chronic disease, which again is one that lasts a long time, and normally months or years, then we now really want to also be looking at prevalence, okay? And so when it comes to a chronic disease, we're going to report both incidence and prevalence, okay? Now it is possible, whoa, Nellie, please hold, what is going on here? Whoa, okay, sorry about that. Why did it, what is happening here? Sorry, y'all. Computer is going crazy, sorry. Okay, so that is something that we need to know when we're trying to figure out what to report. Sorry, I'm not entirely sure where I was mid-sentence when my computer went haywire. Okay, oh yeah. So some diseases may be acute or chronic, right? And so if that is the case, it's always best to report both, okay? So take a second and let's kind of push pause. Which of these two measures would you want to research if you were investigating the efficacy of a vaccine? Here's a little hint. Does a vaccine typically prevent or treat a disease? Well, the goal of a vaccine is to prevent disease, right? So we're going to be more interested in incidence in this case, because we want to know, after people have been vaccinated, are we still seeing a lot of new cases of the disease, right? Because that may tell you something about the efficacy of the vaccine. All right, what statistic would you be more interested in if you are investigating the efficacy of a disease treatment? So here you're going to want to be looking at both incidence and prevalence, okay? Because you want to be examining the total number of cases, so both new and old, when you're looking at if a treatment is effective toward treating this disease. But most important, right, would probably be prevalence here, because you're less worried about are people getting sick, but rather how is the treatment. Okay, so prevalence is really what you would be focusing on here in that example. Okie doke. So next up, what is an epidemiologist? Well, these are going to be the individuals that are studying the disease. They're looking at outbreaks of the disease, what's causing it, you know, where is this happening, and how are different communities of people being effective. And that information is critical because in order to prevent future outbreaks, we need to understand current ones, right? It's providing information we need to figure out how to stop the spread of the disease, you know, in real time, but also again to prevent it. So epidemiologists are helping to keep the public informed of methods to maintain and improve public health. So of course, sometimes these, you know, suggestions, these methods to maintain and improve public health are going to change as we gain more insight about the disease. So this happened with COVID, where when it first really hit the United States, we said, you know, you need to wear gloves if you're out in public, you need to wear a mask. You know, there's this long list of things that we couldn't do. right? Don't touch this, don't breathe this. But then as we learned more about COVID-19, we realized that gloves weren't really helping to minimize the spread of the disease, but really we needed to step up our mask game, right? So as we learn more about a disease through all the information these epidemiologists are collecting, then we might need to change some of our tactics to be more effective at preventative measures. All right, so how are epidemics actually identified? Well, there are two common ways, right, that outbreaks come to the attention of those that need to know. One is through astute individuals, right, that notice the cases of the diseases. They notice that they're happening like frequently or in the same spot, and they'll notice people that have features of this disease, and they're going to go ahead and report it to health authorities. So notice that in some of the examples listed as an astute individual, they tend to be people that are familiar with, right, healthcare, right, or kind of the sciencey side of things, lab workers, physicians, nurses, people that are trained to really notice these things, and they know to report things when they're kind of out of whack. Now, that doesn't mean non-healthcare sciencey people can't do that. They can, but a lot of times there are outbreaks in very specific, locations. And so it's up to the people in that location to let the authorities know, hey, something crazy is going on over here. So that way they can come and research it. So citizens are very important in this. The other way is through public health surveillance systems that are collecting data on these notifiable diseases. So a notifiable disease is a disease that is required by law to be reported to government authorities. And we are going to talk about some of these diseases in Unit 4. But by having healthcare professionals, have to report this information, it's much easier to track these often deadly diseases. And so that way we have an idea of when a certain disease has popped up, where it's at, maybe where it's heading based on, who the infected individuals have come into contact with. And so we can provide this early warning to other people, places, even countries, that something is heading their way. And we saw this with COVID-19, right? We here in the United States knew it was coming, right? It started off in a different part of the world. It was alerted, or I should say reported, that here's this new strain of COVID, and it was making its way through China and other countries, and so we knew pretty much without a doubt that it was going to hit us too, right? The United States is not immune to viral infections, and with international travel, most pathogens can get most places these days. So it was no surprise when COVID-19 made it to the United States. Okay, we're going to do just one more slide for this video, and then we'll kind of change gears. So what happens when there is an outbreak of a disease? So when thinking about what information is most critical, right, we're thinking about our end goal. We are trying to limit the spread of the disease and then prevent it, right? So what are some things we need to know? Well, how is this disease being transmitted? Is it through a contaminated water source? Because that's going to be a lot easier, to work with than, it's spread through respiratory droplets, and you have to figure out, who's had it, where they've been, right? There's a lot of backtracking to get to the original source, for instance. But also, because things are most likely going to spread much quicker if it's through respiratory droplets than if it's, because somebody drank contaminated water. So knowing how the disease is transmitted is really important, as is the setting it is commonly found in, for reasons similar to what I just mentioned. And then, what is the incubation period? Because by knowing the incubation period, we can backtrack easier to find that source and that reservoir. and to kind of know what's coming, right? We know that with COVID, during during like holidays, for instance, where people tend to gather together, well, we know in about, 5 to 11 days, give or take, there's likely going to be an increase in cases just because people have been in close proximity to one another. So knowing the incubation period helps backtrack when necessary, but also to project, statistic-wise. So having this information handy is going to allow us to start characterizing the cases in terms of personal characteristics. Okay? When did someone become ill? Where might they have actually been exposed? And again, that's also where that incubation period is really, really helpful, because if I got sick today, with COVID, they could say, all right, well, where were you in these specific date ranges? But if we don't know the incubation period, then it's much more challenging. Where have you been the past month of your life, right? So there's a lot more possibilities there when we don't actually know the incubation period. So again, armed with this information, it will help us better locate or identify the common element that's going to help us understand why a set of people are ill. All right, so that's going to wrap up this video. The next video will probably just go ahead and finish the rest of these slides, which is going to be looking at information presented on a graph and identifying, which statistic, normally either incidence or prevalence, is going to be most helpful. Are we looking at an endemic or an epidemic? So we're kind of classifying diseases in that sense. All right, y'all, let me know if you have any questions.